The Valdrin Imperium had ruled the eastern spiral arm of the galaxy for 3,000 years. Their ships moved through space like silver sharks, sleek and deadly. Their technology was advanced beyond most species' wildest dreams. They had conquered 47 star systems and brought 200 billion souls under their control. The Valdrin were tall, with blue-gray skin and eyes that glowed with a soft, amber light. They believed themselves to be the pinnacle of evolution, the rightful masters of all they surveyed. Ambassador Thyron stood on the bridge of the warship Eternal Dominion, watching the blue and green planet rotate slowly before him. Earth, the humans called it, a primitive world on the edge of explored space. His subordinates had assured him this would be a simple matter. The humans had only recently developed faster-than-light travel. They had no real weapons to speak of, no shields worth mentioning, and their ships were crude constructions of metal and desperation. "Send the standard message," Thyron said, his voice carrying the weight of imperial authority. "Inform them of their new status as a protectorate of the Imperium. Their resources will be cataloged. Their population will be assessed for useful skills. They have one standard cycle to comply." The communications officer bowed and transmitted the message. Thyron expected the usual response: fear, confusion, perhaps some futile posturing before inevitable surrender. Every species reacted the same way when confronted with Valdrin might. But the response that came back was different. "This is Secretary General Chen of the United Earth Government," a voice said in thickly accented Galactic Common. "We received your message. Our answer is no. Earth is not for sale, trade, or conquest. We suggest you turn your ships around and leave our system immediately." Thyron felt his throat sacs inflate with amusement. "They suggest we leave," he said to his officers. Laughter rippled across the bridge. How delightful. How absolutely provincial. He leaned forward in his command chair. "Inform them that refusal is not an option. We will begin harvesting operations within the cycle. If they resist, their cities will be reduced to ash." What Thyron did not know, what he could not have known, was that humanity had been watching the Valdrin for months. Human ships, small and quiet, had followed Valdrin scout vessels back to their forward bases. Human intelligence had studied every transmission, every tactical deployment, every weakness in their formations. Humanity had learned long ago that knowledge was the first weapon, and they wielded it well. Captain Elizabeth Torres sat in the command center deep beneath the mountains of Colorado. Around her, dozens of analysts worked at holographic displays, tracking every Valdrin ship in the solar system. "Count?" she asked quietly. 73 capital ships, 214 support vessels," her tactical officer replied. "They're arranging themselves in standard occupation formation around Earth and Mars." "And our assets?" "The fleet is ready. All civilian populations are in shelters. The defensive platforms are armed and awaiting your order." Torres studied the display for a long moment. Humanity had spent the last 50 years building in secret, preparing for this exact moment. They had known that eventually someone would come. Someone always came. The galaxy was full of empires that thought themselves invincible, that believed might made right. But humanity remembered its own history. They remembered the empires that had fallen on their own world, the tyrants who had thought themselves gods. And they had learned the most important lesson of all: pride comes before the fall. "Send a final warning," Torres said. "Tell them they have 1 hour to leave the system. After that, we defend our home." Thyron received the message with barely concealed contempt. "They warn us," he said, unable to keep the derision from his voice. "These primitives who only just learned to break the light barrier warn us." He stood from his chair, his full height of 3 meters imposing in the dim bridge lighting. "Begin the bombardment. Target their capital cities. Make it quick. I want this over before the evening meal." The Valdrin fleet opened fire. Massive energy weapons, capable of cracking continents, lanced down toward Earth's surface. but they never reached their targets. Point defense systems, hidden in satellites that had been dismissed as mere communication relays, intercepted the beams. The energy dissipated harmlessly in the upper atmosphere, brilliant flashes of light that illuminated the night sky. Thyron's amusement vanished. "What is this?" he demanded. "How do they have that kind of defensive technology?" Before anyone could answer, alarms shrieked across the bridge. The tactical display lit up with hundreds of new contacts. Human ships, small and fast, were emerging from behind the moon, from the asteroid belt, from hiding places throughout the solar system. They moved with precision and purpose, not like the panicked defense of a desperate species, but like a coordinated military operation. "Evasive maneuvers!" Thyron shouted, but it was too late. The human ships opened fire with kinetic weapons, simple railguns that fired dense metal slugs at relativistic speeds. The Valdran shields, designed to stop energy weapons, were almost useless against solid projectiles moving at a significant fraction of light speed. The first wave of slugs tore through 3 Valdran cruisers, ripping them apart from stem to stern. The human ships didn't stay to fight. They fired and vanished, using short-range jumps to reposition themselves constantly. It was unlike any combat doctrine the Valdran had encountered. Most species fought from fixed positions, trading fire until one side broke. But the humans fought like ghosts, appearing and disappearing, striking and vanishing before return fire could find them. Admiral Wei commanded the human fleet from the carrier vessel Defiance. His strategy was simple but effective. Never give the enemy a stable target. Never fight fair. Use every advantage, no matter how small. His ships carried nuclear warheads, electromagnetic pulse weapons, cyber warfare packages, and even simple explosives. Whatever worked, whatever killed the enemy, that's what they used. "Second wave, execute," Wei ordered calmly. Another group of human ships appeared, this time from the outer system. They had been waiting in the cold dark beyond Pluto, their systems powered down to avoid detection. Now they accelerated inward, their missiles already launching. The Valdran fleet found itself caught between 2 forces, unable to properly defend against attacks from multiple vectors. Thyron watched his fleet being torn apart and felt something he had not experienced in his long career: fear. "Withdraw to defensive formation," he commanded. "Concentrate our fire. We need to create a kill zone." But the humans had anticipated this too. As the Valdran ships drew together, human attack craft deployed mines throughout the battle space. Simple, crude devices that would have been laughable against most opponents. But when a Valdran battleship's shields were already weakened by railgun fire, when its sensors were scrambled by electromagnetic pulses, a simple nuclear mine could cripple even the mightiest vessel. The battle that Thyron had expected to be over in minutes stretched into hours. His fleet, the pride of the Imperium, was being systematically destroyed by an enemy they had dismissed as primitive. The humans used every dirty trick in existence. They hacked Valdran communication systems and fed false orders. They used decoys and electronic warfare to confuse targeting systems. They even rammed damaged ships into Valdran vessels when no other option presented itself. As the Eternal Dominion's shields failed and human missiles began pounding the hull, Thyron finally understood the mistake he had made. He had judged humanity by their technology, by their brief time in space, by their apparent weakness. But he had not understood what made them dangerous. Humans didn't need to be the strongest or the most advanced. They just needed to be willing to do whatever it took to survive. They fought with a desperation and cunning born of a violent history, a species that had clawed its way to the top of its own world's food chain through intelligence, adaptability, and sheer stubborn refusal to die. The last thing Thyron saw before the bridge exploded around him was a human missile, crude and simple in design, but traveling fast enough and carrying enough explosive force to crack his ship in half. In his final moment, he realized that the Imperium had made the same mistake that every fallen empire before them had made. They had angered humanity, and humanity did not forgive. The news of the Valdran fleet's destruction spread through the galaxy like wildfire. The Imperium, shocked and outraged, demanded an explanation. How could a newly spacefaring species defeat their finest battle group? The answer, when it came, was simple and terrifying. Humanity had studied war for its entire existence. They had refined killing into an art form long before they reached the stars. Every human soldier was a veteran of 1,000 simulated battles. Every human ship carried weapons designed through centuries of conflict. Humanity didn't just know how to fight, they understood violence at a fundamental level that most species, cushioned by eons of civilization, had forgotten. The Valdran High Command convened in their crystal palace on the capital world of Valdros Prime. 12 senior military commanders and the Empress herself sat in judgment of the disaster. One battle group, the Empress said, her voice cold with fury. We lost an entire battle group to a species we classified as negligible. The humans fought dishonorably, one commander protested. They used deception, refused direct combat, employed weapons of mass destruction without hesitation. They fought to win, another commander countered. That is all that matters. The Empress raised a hand for silence. The question before us is simple. Do we accept this humiliation, or do we respond with overwhelming force? The debate lasted for hours, but the conclusion was inevitable. The Imperium could not allow such a defeat to stand. Their reputation throughout the galaxy depended on an image of invincibility. If they appeared weak, their other subject species might rebel. If they backed down now, the entire structure of their empire could crumble. Assemble the Grand Armada, the Empress commanded. I want 500 capital ships, 2,000 support vessels, and our most experienced commanders. We will reduce Earth to a lifeless rock and make an example that will echo through the ages. The mobilization took 3 months. The Valdran pulled ships from garrisons throughout their territory, stripped defenses from conquered worlds, and committed resources that had been reserved for other campaigns. It was the largest military operation in their history, and it had a single goal: the complete annihilation of humanity. The Empress herself would command the fleet from the super dreadnought Celestial Wrath, a vessel so massive it could serve as a mobile fortress. Its main weapon could destroy a planet from orbit in a matter of hours. While the Valdran prepared their revenge, humanity was not idle. The victory over Thyron's fleet had bought them time, but everyone knew it wouldn't last. Captain Torres had been promoted to admiral and given command of Earth's defensive strategy. She stood before the United Earth Council, presenting her assessment. "They'll come back," she said bluntly, "and when they do, they'll bring everything they have. We hurt their pride, and empires like the Valdran can't tolerate that." "Can we win?" Secretary General Chen asked. Torres considered the question carefully. "Not in a straight fight. If they bring their full military might to bear, we'll be overwhelmed eventually. But we don't need to win in a straight fight. We need to make them bleed so badly that they decide we're not worth the cost." "What do you propose?" "We take the fight to them. We've been studying the intelligence gathered during the first battle. We know where their supply bases are, where their shipyards are located, which systems are lightly defended. Instead of waiting for them to bring the war to us, we bring it to them. We hit their infrastructure, disrupt their logistics, force them to defend 1,000 targets at once. We make them afraid to sleep at night." The proposal was radical and dangerous. It would mean sending humanity's limited fleet deep into enemy territory, abandoning the defensive advantage of their home system. But the alternative was to wait for certain destruction. The council voted, and the decision was unanimous. Humanity would go on the offensive. Admiral Wei led the first strike force. 50 ships, carrying humanity's best pilots and most advanced weapons, jumped into the Colvin system, site of a major Valdran shipyard. They arrived without warning, their jump signatures masked by new technology that humanity had developed specifically for this purpose. The Valdran defenders were caught completely off guard. Human missiles and railguns tore into the orbital facilities before the station's weapons could even power up. Half-constructed warships exploded in their berths. Repair docks were reduced to twisted metal. Within an hour, the shipyard that had taken decades to build was nothing but debris. Before the Valdran could respond, the human fleet jumped away. They appeared next in the Draven system, destroying a supply depot that fed 3 frontier sectors. Then they hit a fuel refinery in the Korthos system, a communication relay in the Philian system, and a military academy on Valdran colony world of Turthos. Each strike was swift, brutal, and devastating. The human ships would appear, unleash everything they had, and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. The Valdran military found itself fighting a war unlike anything in their experience. They were accustomed to set-piece battles, to lines of ships exchanging fire until one side retreated. But the humans refused to play by those rules. They struck from unexpected angles, used unconventional weapons, and showed no hesitation in targeting civilian infrastructure if it had military value. A Valdran food production facility that supplied the fleet was destroyed. A water processing plant that served a military base was contaminated. A power generation station was sabotaged, leaving an entire sector in darkness. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. Valdran civilians who had lived for generations in the security of their empire's protection suddenly found themselves on the front lines. Human ships could appear anywhere, at any time, and there was no way to predict where they would strike next. The Empire's military was forced to spread its forces thin, trying to defend everything and succeeding in defending nothing. On Valdros Prime, the Empress watched reports of the attacks with growing fury. "How are they doing this?" she demanded. "How can such a small force cause so much damage?" Her chief military advisor, Admiral Korthan, studied the tactical displays with a troubled expression. "They're not fighting to conquer, Your Majesty. They're fighting to destroy. They don't care about holding territory or taking prisoners. They hit us where we're weak, then disappear before we can retaliate. It's asymmetric warfare, and we have no effective counter." "Then develop one," the Empress snapped. "I want these humans found and destroyed. Use whatever resources are necessary." But resources were becoming the problem. Each human attack disrupted supply chains that fed other parts of the Empire. Shipyards that should have been producing new warships were instead trying to rebuild destroyed infrastructure. Fleets that should have been assembling for the great offensive against Earth were instead scattered across 100 systems, chasing ghosts. The economic strain was beginning to show. Conquered species that had been pacified for generations saw the Valdran's weakness and began to stir with thoughts of rebellion. Meanwhile, humanity's own situation was deteriorating. Every strike mission meant losing ships and pilots that couldn't be easily replaced. Earth's shipyards worked around the clock, but they couldn't match the production capacity of an empire spanning dozens of star systems. Admiral Torres knew they were fighting on borrowed time. The question was whether they could hurt the Valdran badly enough before their own resources ran out. She stood in the war room, examining the intelligence reports from their latest reconnaissance missions. The Valdran Grand Armada was still assembling, but the pace had slowed significantly. Ships that were supposed to join the fleet were being diverted to defend critical infrastructure. Supply vessels that should have been carrying munitions and fuel were instead carrying construction materials to rebuild what humanity had destroyed. "We're changing the calculus," Torres said to her staff. "They came at us expecting a quick, easy victory. Now they're realizing this will be a long, bloody war of attrition. And empires don't like those kinds of wars." "How long can we keep this up?" her executive officer asked. "Not forever, but maybe long enough." Torres pulled up a star chart showing the Valdran territory. "Their empire looks strong from the outside, but it's actually fragile. They rule through fear and overwhelming force. Take away that appearance of invincibility, and the whole thing could come apart. We're not just fighting the Valdren, we're showing every conquered species in their empire that resistance is possible. The assessment proved prophetic. 2 months after humanity's offensive began, the Korvax species in the Helian sector rose in rebellion. They had been subjugated by the Valdren for 2 centuries, but the sight of humans successfully resisting inspired them to take up arms. The Valdren were forced to divert ships from the Grand Armada to put down the uprising. Then the Drenth in the Omega Cluster rebelled, then the Felorians. Soon the Valdren Empire was fighting on a dozen fronts simultaneously, each rebellion feeding off the others, each one requiring precious military resources to contain. The Empress realized, too late, the trap they had fallen into. By committing so completely to destroying humanity, they had exposed the weakness at the heart of their empire. The conquered species had only remained pacified because they believed resistance was futile. But humanity had proven that the Valdren could be hurt, could be made to bleed, could even be defeated. That knowledge spread like a virus through the empire, and there was no way to suppress it. Admiral Korthan presented the grim reality to the Empress. "We face a choice, Your Majesty. We can continue the campaign against Earth and risk losing our existing territory to rebellion, or we can abandon the offensive and focus on securing what we already control." The Empress sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the tactical displays that showed her empire fracturing before her eyes. 3,000 years of Valdren dominance, brought to the brink of collapse by a species they had dismissed as primitive. "How did this happen?" she asked quietly. Korthan chose his words carefully. "We underestimated them, Your Majesty. We saw their technology and assumed they were weak. We saw their small fleet and assumed they were helpless. But we failed to understand their nature. Humans don't think like us. They don't fight like us. They've spent their entire evolutionary history as predators, climbing to dominance on a world filled with dangers. War isn't something they had to learn. It's encoded in their very being." "So what do we do?" the Empress asked, the question heavy with implications. To abandon the campaign against Earth would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge that a species they had called primitive had brought the mighty Valdren Imperium to its knees. But to continue would risk everything they had built over millennia. Before Korthan could answer, an aide burst into the chamber. "Your Majesty, we're receiving a transmission from the humans. They're requesting a communication channel with you directly." The Empress felt her throat sacs constrict with anger, but she was also curious. What would the humans say? Would they gloat? Would they demand surrender? She nodded. "Open the channel." The holographic display shimmered and resolved into the image of an elderly human female in a military uniform. Admiral Torres looked tired, as though she hadn't slept in weeks, but her eyes were sharp and determined. "Empress," she said, her galactic common flawless, "I am Admiral Elena Torres, Supreme Commander of the United Earth Defense Forces. I'm contacting you to propose an end to this conflict." The Empress leaned forward. "You wish to surrender? To beg for mercy?" Torres smiled thinly. "No. I'm offering you a way to save your empire before it collapses completely. Here are the terms. The Valdren Imperium will recognize Earth and all human colonies as sovereign territory, never to be attacked or interfered with. In exchange, humanity will cease all offensive operations against Valdren targets and will not actively support the rebellions currently occurring within your territory." "You dare dictate terms to me?" the Empress said, her voice rising. "We could crush you utterly if we committed our full strength." "You could try," Torres agreed calmly, "but the question is whether you'd have an empire left when you were finished. Every day you focus on us, you lose more control over your conquered species. Every ship you send against Earth is a ship that isn't protecting your territory. Tell me, Your Majesty, how many rebellions can you fight simultaneously? 10? 20? Because if this war continues, that's what you'll face. We've already made contact with resistance movements on 24 worlds. We've shared technology, tactics, and most importantly, hope. The knowledge that the great Valdran Empire can be resisted. The Empress felt the truth of the words like a blade between her ribs. The humans weren't offering peace out of weakness. They were offering it because they knew that the war was already lost for the Valdran, even if they didn't realize it yet. The Empire could probably destroy humanity, given enough time and resources, but the cost would be everything else they had built. It was a choice between pride and survival. "You're asking me to accept that we attacked you and failed," the Empress said, "to acknowledge weakness before the entire galaxy." Torres shook her head. "I'm asking you to be smarter than every other empire that's fallen throughout history. The strong survive not by winning every battle, but by knowing when to stop fighting. You made a mistake. You underestimated us, and it cost you dearly. But it doesn't have to cost you everything. Accept our terms, and you can rebuild. Continue the war, and you'll join the long list of empires that destroyed themselves through pride and stubbornness." The transmission ended, leaving the Empress alone with her thoughts and her advisors. The chamber was silent, each person grappling with the implications. Finally, Admiral Corthan spoke. "She's right, Your Majesty. If we pursue this campaign to its conclusion, we win a symbolic victory against Earth, but lose strategic control of our empire. The rebellions will spread, and we'll spend decades trying to reconquer what we already owned. Thousands of our ships will be destroyed. Millions of our people will die. And for what? To punish one species for daring to resist us? What will the other species think?" the Empress asked. "If we make peace with humans, will it not encourage more rebellions?" "Perhaps," Corthan admitted, "but there's a difference between the humans and our subject species. The humans were never conquered. They defeated us in open combat, forced us to negotiate from a position of weakness. The other species know this. If we make peace, we can frame it not as surrender, but as pragmatic recognition of a worthy adversary. The humans become the exception that proves the rule. The one species fierce enough and crazy enough to take on the Imperium and survive. It might actually enhance our reputation in a strange way. We become the Empire wise enough to know when to fight and when to negotiate." The Empress considered this carefully. It was a face-saving narrative, but it might work. The alternative was continuing a war that was bleeding the Empire white, while the real threat came from internal collapse. She thought about the long line of Valdran rulers before her, emperors and empresses who had built and maintained this great civilization for 3,000 years. What would they want her to do? Sacrifice everything for pride, or do whatever necessary to preserve the Empire? "Contact the humans," she said at last. "Tell them we accept their terms, but with additional provisions. We want a non-aggression treaty that binds both sides. We want assurances that they won't share their military technology with our subject species. And we want a buffer zone between our territories where neither side conducts military operations." Torres received the Valdran response with relief and exhaustion. She had been gambling that the Empress was rational enough to see the strategic reality, and the gamble had paid off. The treaty negotiations took another 2 weeks, with both sides making minor concessions but holding firm on the essential points. When the final document was signed, broadcast across the galaxy for all to see, it sent shockwaves through the civilized worlds. The Valdran Imperium, one of the greatest military powers in known space, had negotiated peace with a species they had intended to conquer. Not because they had been defeated completely, but because they recognized that defeating humanity would cost more than any possible victory was worth. On Earth, people celebrated in the streets. They had faced annihilation and survived through courage, cunning, and sheer stubborn determination. But Torres didn't celebrate. She stood in the war room, looking at the casualty reports, the lists of ships lost, the names of pilots who would never come home. Victory had a price, and humanity had paid it in blood. She thought about the future, about the other empires out there in the galaxy, the other species who might look at humanity and see easy prey. They would need to be ready, always ready, because the galaxy was a dangerous place, and peace was always temporary. Secretary General Chen found her there, staring at the displays. "You should be celebrating, Admiral. You saved our species." Torres shook her head. "I just bought us time. The Valdren aren't the only empire out there. Sooner or later, someone else will come. Someone who doesn't know what we're capable of, or who thinks they can succeed where the Valdren failed. We need to use this time wisely, build more ships, develop better weapons, train more soldiers. And we need to make sure that every potential enemy knows what happened here, that they understand the cost of making humanity angry." Chen nodded slowly. "What about the Valdren rebellions, the species fighting for their freedom?" "That's complicated," Torres admitted. "We promise not to actively support them, but information has a way of spreading. If some of our tactical manuals happen to end up in the hands of resistance groups, if some of our retired military advisors happen to take private contracts as consultants, well, we can't control every individual's actions, can we?" Chen smiled slightly. "No, I suppose we can't. The peace treaty between humanity and the Valdren Imperium held, but it fundamentally changed the balance of power in the galaxy. Other species watched and learned. If the mighty Valdren could be fought to a standstill by a newly spacefaring race, then perhaps they weren't as invincible as everyone believed. The rebellions within Valdren territory continued, sometimes succeeding, sometimes being crushed, but always sapping the Empire's strength. The Imperium survived, but it would never again be what it once was. The age of unquestioned Valdren dominance was over. Humanity, meanwhile, experienced a renaissance. The war had united Earth's fractious nations in a way that decades of diplomacy never could. When you fought together against extinction, old grudges and territorial disputes seemed petty. The military technology developed for the war found peaceful applications. The shipyards that had built warships now constructed colony vessels and exploration craft. Humanity spread outward into the galaxy with new confidence, aware of the dangers but unafraid to face them. Admiral Torres retired 2 years after the war ended. She spent her remaining years teaching at the new Academy of Strategic Studies, training the next generation of human officers. Her lectures were famous throughout Earth's military for their blunt assessment of humanity's strengths and weaknesses. "We're not the strongest species in the galaxy," she would tell her students. "We're not the smartest, not the most advanced, not the most numerous. But we have one advantage that has served us well throughout our history. We refuse to quit. When every rational calculation says we should surrender, when the odds are impossible and the enemy is overwhelming, humans look at the situation and ask, not how do we survive, but how do we win? That's what makes us dangerous. That's what the Valdren learned. That's what every empire in this galaxy will eventually learn if they're foolish enough to make us their enemy." Her words proved prophetic. 20 years after the war with the Valdren, the Zephyron Collective made the same mistake. They were a mercantile empire, wealthy and technologically sophisticated, who decided that humanity's growing influence in their sector was unacceptable. They didn't want to conquer Earth. They just wanted to intimidate humanity, to remind them of their place as newcomers in an established galactic order. So they blockaded human trade routes, seized human merchant vessels, and demanded tribute for the right to conduct commerce in their space. The response from Earth was swift and uncompromising. The Zephyrons had assumed that humanity's victory over the Valdren was a fluke, or perhaps that humanity had exhausted its military capability in that conflict. They were wrong on both counts. The human fleet that arrived in Zephyron space was 3 times the size of the one that had fought the Valdren, equipped with weapons systems a generation more advanced. But more importantly, they brought with them the lessons learned from that first war. They knew how to fight an asymmetric campaign. They knew how to exploit economic vulnerabilities. They knew how to turn an enemy's strengths into weaknesses. The Zephron Collective relied on a vast network of automated trade stations and AI-managed supply chains. Human cyber warfare specialists infiltrated these systems and turned them into chaos. Ships carrying vital supplies were rerouted to empty sectors of space. Financial records were scrambled, causing economic panic. The Zephron's carefully balanced economy, optimized over centuries, collapsed within weeks. When they tried to respond militarily, they found that their ships, built for commerce protection rather than serious warfare, were no match for human warships designed with brutal efficiency. The Zephron Collective sued for peace within 3 months. The terms were harsh. They would pay reparations for every human vessel seized, recognize human trade rights throughout the sector, and cede 3 systems as a buffer zone. More importantly, they would serve as an object lesson. The galaxy watched as another major power learned the cost of angering humanity. The pattern was becoming clear. Humanity didn't start fights, but they finished them decisively. Not every interaction between humanity and the galactic community ended in conflict. The Turellian Commonwealth reached out to Earth with offers of trade and cultural exchange. They were a democratic federation of species who shared many of humanity's values. The Turellians had watched the conflicts between humans and the old empires with interest. They recognized in humanity a kindred spirit, a species that valued freedom and was willing to fight for it. The alliance that formed between the Turellian Commonwealth and the United Earth government became one of the stabilizing forces in the galaxy. But there were others who learned nothing from the examples of the Valdren and the Zephrons. The Krell Dominion was an old, proud empire built on rigid hierarchies and absolute obedience to authority. They viewed humanity's individualism and chaotic decision-making process as weakness. When human explorers discovered an ancient cache of technological artifacts in neutral space, the Krell demanded that all findings be turned over to them as the rightful custodians of galactic heritage. When humanity refused, citing the artifact's location in unclaimed territory, the Krell saw it as an unforgivable insult to their authority. The Krell War was different from the previous conflicts. The Krell were genuine military experts with a warrior tradition stretching back millennia. They didn't underestimate humanity, didn't make the mistake of assuming an easy victory. They came prepared for a serious fight, with tactics that had been proven over countless campaigns. For the first time, humanity faced an enemy that could match them in space combat, that understood maneuver warfare and strategic thinking. The war lasted 3 years and was brutal beyond anything humanity had previously experienced. Entire colony worlds were evacuated under fire. Human fleets won some battles and lost others. Casualties mounted on both sides as the conflict escalated. But humanity had one advantage that the Krell hadn't fully appreciated: allies. The Turellian Commonwealth joined the war, bringing their own considerable military forces. Other species who had been victims of Krell expansion saw an opportunity and opened new fronts. What the Krell intended as a limited war to punish human arrogance became a galaxy-wide conflict that threatened their entire empire. The turning point came at the Battle of Zirion. A combined human-Turellian fleet, outnumbered 2-1, managed to destroy the Krell's primary shipyard through a daring deep strike operation. The human admiral who planned the operation, a brilliant strategist named James Chen, grandson of the Secretary General who had led Earth during the Valdren crisis, used a tactic that seemed insane on its surface. He divided his fleet, sent the smaller force to engage the Krell defenders head-on, while the larger force approached from an unexpected angle, jumping in from a region of space the Krell had thought too dangerous to navigate due to gravitational anomalies. The gambit worked. The shipyard was destroyed, taking with it the Krell's ability to replace their losses. After Zirion, the Krell War became a slow retreat for the Dominion. They won tactical victories but lost strategic ground. Their rigid command structure, which had been a strength in smaller conflicts, became a liability in a multi-front war requiring flexibility and adaptation. Meanwhile, human commanders in the field were given broad authority to make decisions, to take risks, to innovate new tactics on the fly. The Krell simply couldn't keep up with an enemy that refused to fight by any established rules. The war ended with the Treaty of Antar, negotiated on neutral ground with representatives from a dozen species present. The Krell Dominion acknowledged human sovereignty over the disputed artifacts and paid reparations for the colonies they had attacked. More significantly, they agreed to reforms within their own territory, granting more autonomy to subject species. It was a humiliating defeat for an empire that had never known failure, and it sent the clearest message yet to the galaxy. Humanity could not be intimidated, could not be conquered, and attempting to do so would only result in disaster for the aggressor. 50 years after first contact with the Valdren, humanity had gone from a barely spacefaring species to a major galactic power. They controlled 30 star systems, had colonies on 50 worlds, and maintained the third largest fleet in known space. But more important than the numbers was humanity's reputation. They were known as the species that empires should fear, the ones who could bring down civilizations that had endured for millennia. The phrase, "Don't anger humanity," became common wisdom throughout the galaxy, repeated by diplomats and military commanders alike. Yet humanity itself had changed in subtle ways. The constant state of warfare, the need to always be ready for the next threat, had left its mark on human society. Earth was more militarized than it had been before first contact, more suspicious of outsiders, quicker to resort to force when diplomacy failed. Some humans worried that they were becoming what they had fought against, an aggressive, expansionist power that other species feared. This debate came to a head during the frontier crisis. Human colonists on the world of New Terra discovered that their planet was home to an intelligent species, the Sorens, who lived in the deep oceans and had gone undetected during initial surveys. The Sorens were primitive by galactic standards, barely into their industrial age, but they were sentient and had their own civilization. Under galactic law, such a discovery should have resulted in the immediate cessation of colonization and the designation of the world as protected territory. But New Terra already had 2 million human colonists who had built lives there, who had families and homes and communities. Evacuating them would be a massive undertaking, and where would they go? Earth was crowded, and all other suitable colony worlds were already claimed. The military argued that humanity's security required controlling New Terra due to its strategic location. Economic interests pointed out the valuable resources being extracted from the planet. The colonists themselves protested that they had done nothing wrong, that they couldn't have known about the Sorens, and that abandoning their homes was unjust. On the other side, many humans, particularly those in the Terrellian Alliance, argued that abandoning the Sorens would be a betrayal of everything humanity claimed to stand for. If they had fought against empires that saw weaker species as resources to be exploited, how could they now do the same thing? The debate raged for months, splitting human society. Some called for the forcible removal of the colonists to protect the Sorens. Others demanded that human interests take priority. The United Earth government found itself paralyzed, unable to choose between two unacceptable options. President Aisha Okoro, who had taken office just months before the crisis erupted, spent weeks studying the history of human imperialism on Earth itself. She read about the colonial empires that had once dominated her own continent, about the justifications they had used, about the harm they had caused to indigenous peoples. She also read about humanity's wars against the galactic empires, about the principles they had claimed to fight for. Finally, she made a decision that would define her presidency and humanity's place in the galaxy. "We will evacuate New Terra," she announced in a speech broadcast throughout human space. "Not because it's easy, not because it's convenient, but because it's right. We fought the Valdren because they tried to take our world without our consent. We fought the Zephrons because they tried to dictate how we could live our lives. We fought the Krell because they believed their desires superseded our rights. If we now do to the Sorns what these empires tried to do to us, then everything we've fought for becomes meaningless. We become the very monsters we opposed. The decision was controversial and costly. Relocating 2 million people required a massive effort. New colonies had to be established, resources diverted, plans changed. Many of the new Terra colonists were angry and resentful, feeling abandoned by their government. But President Okoro held firm. "Being powerful doesn't give us the right to ignore the rights of others," she said. "If anything, it creates a greater responsibility to act justly. Let this be humanity's legacy in the galaxy. Not that we were too strong to be conquered, but that we were wise enough not to become conquerors ourselves." The evacuation of New Terra took 5 years. The Sorens, when they finally made contact with humans through translators, didn't fully understand what had happened. Why would the powerful sky dwellers leave their world? It made no sense in their cultural framework. But human diplomats worked patiently to explain the concept of sovereign rights, of the principle that each species had the right to their own world and their own future. The Sorens listened and remembered. Generations later, when they eventually developed their own spacefaring technology, they would become humanity's staunchest allies, never forgetting the species that had given up valuable territory because it was the right thing to do. The New Terra decision marked a turning point in how humanity saw itself. They were no longer just the species that empires feared. They were also the species that empires could respect. Other civilizations took note. The Valdren, watching from their diminished but still substantial empire, saw that humanity was capable of restraint, that they weren't driven purely by expansion and conquest. It made future diplomatic interactions easier, based on mutual respect rather than mutual fear. But the galaxy remained a dangerous place. New threats emerged regularly. The Hive Collective, a species of insectoid aliens with an utterly alien group mind, began expanding into civilized space. They didn't negotiate, didn't communicate in any meaningful way, and saw all other life forms as either resources or obstacles. Humanity found itself joining a coalition of species to contain the Hive threat. The war that followed was long and brutal, testing humanity's military capabilities to their limit. But they fought alongside former enemies like the Valdren and the Krell, united by the need to survive against an existential threat that cared nothing for treaties or diplomacy. The Hive War lasted a generation and cost millions of lives across multiple species. But humanity's contribution was crucial. Human tactics, developed through years of fighting asymmetric wars against superior foes, proved effective against the Hive's swarm tactics. Human adaptability allowed them to innovate new weapon systems faster than the Hive could evolve counters. And perhaps most importantly, human diplomatic skills helped hold the coalition together when differences between species threatened to fracture it. When the Hive was finally contained, pushed back into their own territory, and contained behind a quarantine zone maintained by the Allied fleets, humanity emerged with a new role in galactic affairs. They were no longer seen as dangerous newcomers or upstart primitives. They were recognized as leaders, a species that other civilizations looked to in times of crisis. The United Earth government found itself mediating disputes between other species, hosting peace conferences, and serving as neutral ground for negotiations. It was a role humanity had never sought, but had earned through demonstrated capability and commitment to principle. 100 years after the first Valdren fleet had appeared in Earth's skies, the galaxy was a very different place. The old empires remained, but they were transformed. The Valdren Imperium had evolved into a more democratic confederation, granting greater autonomy to member species. The Krell Dominion had reformed its military culture, adopting more flexible command structures influenced by human tactics. The Zephyron Collective had diversified its economy and loosened its control over trade routes. Each of these changes could be traced directly or indirectly to humanity's influence on the galactic order. Earth itself was unrecognizable from the world that had first faced alien contact. The cities had expanded upward and outward, integrating alien technology and architectural styles. Humans lived and worked alongside Tyrellians, reformed Valdrin, even some Krell who had chosen to emigrate. The planet had become a cosmopolitan hub, a meeting place for dozens of species. But beneath the gleaming towers and bustling spaceports, the old defensive installations remained. The orbital fortresses still stood watch. The fleet yards never stopped building ships. Humanity remembered the lesson of the Valdrin. Peace was always temporary, and preparedness was the price of survival. In the Academy of Strategic Studies, now attended by officers from multiple species, instructors still taught the campaigns of the Valdrin War, the Zephyron conflict, and the Krell War. They analyzed the tactics, studied the decisions, examined the mistakes and victories, but they also taught something more important, the philosophy that had guided humanity through a century of conflict. Power without restraint leads to tyranny. Victory without honor leads to brutality. Strength must be tempered by wisdom, force by justice. These principles, learned through hard experience, became humanity's gift to the galaxy. Admiral Chen, elderly now and nearing the end of his service, gave the commencement address to a class of graduating officers. He looked out at the faces before him, human and alien alike, and felt a sense of continuity with his grandfather, who had helped guide Earth through its first contact with hostile aliens. "You stand here today because brave people made hard choices," he said. "They chose to fight when fighting seemed hopeless. They chose to make peace when pride demanded vengeance. They chose to do what was right, even when it cost them dearly. You inherit their legacy, but you also inherit their responsibility. The galaxy is safer than it was a century ago, but it will never be truly safe. There will always be those who seek power through conquest, who view other species as lesser beings to be exploited or destroyed. Your duty is to stand against them, as your predecessors did. But it is also your duty to ensure that humanity never becomes what it once fought against. Power is a test. The question is not whether we can win, but whether we can win and remain worthy of victory." The speech resonated throughout human space and beyond. It crystallized a philosophy that had been developing over decades of conflict and growth. Humanity had learned that being strong wasn't enough. They had to be strong and just, powerful and principled, capable of violence but committed to peace. It was a difficult balance to maintain, and they didn't always succeed. There were incidents, mistakes, times when human forces used excessive force, or human politicians made questionable decisions. But unlike the old empires, humanity acknowledged these failures, tried to learn from them, and worked to do better. The galaxy's historians, studying the rise of humanity from primitive world to major power, identified a pattern. Every fallen empire made one fatal mistake. They angered humanity. But that simple observation missed the deeper truth. The empires didn't fall simply because humanity was militarily powerful. They fell because they represented a way of thinking that the galaxy was gradually moving past. The idea that might made right, that advanced civilizations had the right to dominate lesser ones, that peace came through subjugation rather than cooperation. Humanity didn't invent these alternative values, but they demonstrated them through their actions. They showed that a species could be both strong and just, that power could be exercised with restraint, that security could come through alliances rather than conquest. Not everyone appreciated this lesson. There were species who saw humanity's influence as dangerous, who preferred the old order where power relationships were clear and uncomplicated. There were human factions who believed that humanity should seek dominance while they had the advantage, before other species caught up militarily. The debate about humanity's role in the galaxy continued, in council chambers and universities, in ships traveling between stars and settlements on distant worlds. It was a conversation that would probably never end, because it touched on fundamental questions about power, justice, and the kind of civilization humanity wanted to build. What was undeniable was that humanity had changed the galaxy in profound ways. The old empires that had seemed eternal had been humbled or reformed. New alliances had been forged based on mutual respect rather than fear. Species that had been subjugated for generations had gained their freedom, or at least greater autonomy. The galactic community, once dominated by a handful of ancient powers, had become more diverse, more democratic, more dynamic. Humanity hadn't done this alone. They had allies and partners who contributed their own wisdom and strength. But they had been the catalyst for change. In the end, perhaps that was humanity's greatest strength. Not their military might, not their tactical brilliance, not their technological innovation. It was their refusal to accept that things had to be the way they had always been. When the Valdrin told them they would be conquered, humans said, no. When the Zephrons told them to pay tribute, humans said, no. When the Krell told them to submit, humans said, no. And when their own instincts told them to become conquerors themselves, to do unto others what others had tried to do to them, they said no to that as well. That capacity for defiance, coupled with the wisdom to know when to fight and when to show restraint, made humanity different. It made them dangerous to those who would be tyrants and valuable to those who sought peace. The young officers graduating from the academy, human and alien alike, carried this legacy forward. They would serve on ships patrolling the boundaries of civilized space, protecting against threats from the unknown regions. They would staff diplomatic missions, negotiating treaties and resolving disputes. They would teach the next generation, passing on the lessons learned through a century of conflict and growth. Some would die in battle, defending their homes and allies. Others would live long lives, seeing the galaxy continue to change in ways no one could predict. But all of them understood the central truth that their instructors had tried to teach them. The galaxy was vast and full of dangers. There would always be those who sought power through force, who viewed compassion as weakness and negotiation as surrender. Against such threats, strength was necessary, but strength alone was not enough. History was littered with powerful empires that had fallen because they mistook force for righteousness, conquest for security. Humanity's task was to be different, to be better, to be strong enough to defend what mattered, but wise enough to know that some things couldn't be taken by force. Freedom, respect, justice, these had to be earned and granted, not imposed. Admiral Chen watched the graduating class file past, each officer saluting as they received their commissions. He saw hope in their faces, determination, the eagerness of youth combined with the best training the galaxy could provide. They would make mistakes. They would face impossible choices. Some would fail to live up to the ideals they had been taught. But enough would succeed. Enough would find the courage and wisdom to do what was right, to ensure that humanity's legacy endured. As the ceremony concluded and the new officers dispersed to their assignments, Chen remained on the stage, looking up at the stars visible through the Academy's transparent dome. Somewhere out there, on the former worlds of the Valdrin Imperium, monuments stood to those who had died in the First Contact War. On Zephron stations, merchants traded freely with humans, the old hostilities forgotten. In Krell space, military academies taught courses on human tactical doctrine alongside their own ancient traditions. The galaxy remembered, and through remembering, learned. The story of humanity's rise was told in different ways by different species. The Valdrin saw it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating any potential opponent, no matter how primitive they might appear. The Turellians told it as a story of alliance and mutual support, emphasizing how cooperation between species achieved what neither could accomplish alone. The Krell framed it as a narrative about honor in combat and respect for worthy adversaries. Each version contained truth, but none captured the complete picture, because the real story wasn't about humanity being special or unique. It was about what happens when any species, pushed to its limits, refuses to surrender. The galaxy had seen countless civilizations rise and fall over eons. Some collapsed from internal corruption, others were conquered by external enemies. Still others simply faded as their people lost the will to continue. But occasionally, very occasionally, a species emerged that combined strength with principle, power with purpose. These were the civilizations that endured, that left lasting marks on history. Humanity's story was still being written. They had survived first contact, won their wars, and established themselves as a major power. But survival and success were only the beginning. The real test would be whether they could maintain their principles as generations passed and memories of hardship faded. Would their descendants remember why they fought? Would they understand that their strength came not from weapons or ships, but from the values that guided their use? Would they resist the temptation to become the very empires they had opposed? These questions would be answered by the young officers leaving the academy, by the children growing up on Earth, in the colonies, by the leaders who would emerge in the decades and centuries to come. The future was uncertain, as it always was. But Chen felt cautiously optimistic. Humanity had been tested repeatedly and had proven resilient, not just in military terms, but in moral ones. They had learned to fight when fighting was necessary and to show restraint when restraint was wisdom. That was a lesson that never stopped being relevant. On a small human colony called New Hope, children of multiple species played together in streets where once only conflict had seemed possible. A young human girl, maybe 8 years old, laughed as she chased a Turellian boy through a garden where earth plants grew alongside alien flora. They were the generation born after the wars, children who had never known a time when humans and aliens were enemies. For them, the galaxy was simply home, a place where different species lived together, sometimes in conflict, but mostly in peace. Their teacher, an elderly human woman who had served as a medic during the Krell War, watched them play with a mixture of joy and melancholy. She remembered the battles, the casualties, the desperate times when survival seemed impossible. But she also remembered why they fought, to preserve the possibility of moments like this, children playing in peace, building a future better than the past. "Remember to do your homework," she called out as the children ran past. "Tomorrow we're learning about the first contact protocols." "Why do we need to learn that?" the human girl asked, pausing in her game. "We already met all the aliens." The teacher smiled. "Because the galaxy is vast, child, and we've only explored a tiny fraction of it. Someday you might be the one who makes first contact with a new species. You'll need to know how to do it right, how to approach with respect and caution, how to find common ground, even when you don't speak the same language or share the same biology. That's the most important skill in the galaxy, learning to understand those who are different from you." The girl nodded solemnly, then turned and ran back to her game. The teacher watched for a moment longer, then returned to her classroom to prepare the next day's lesson. She would teach them about the Valdrin first contact, about the mistakes made on both sides, about the war that could perhaps have been avoided if either species had approached the other with less arrogance and more humility. Then she would teach them about the peace that followed, about how former enemies became partners, about the slow, difficult work of building trust across the void between species. These were lessons that couldn't be learned from textbooks alone. They required experience, mistakes, sometimes tragedy. But by studying history, the next generation could perhaps avoid some of the pitfalls that their ancestors had stumbled into. They could learn that strength without wisdom led to destruction, that fear without understanding bred conflict, that peace required constant effort from all parties. These truths were universal, as relevant for individuals as for entire civilizations. Across human space, similar lessons were being taught in thousands of schools, academies, and training centers. The curriculum varied by location and instructor, but the core message remained constant. Humanity had survived and thrived not by being the strongest or the smartest, but by being adaptable, determined, and guided by principles that transcended immediate self-interest. This was the heritage being passed down, the foundation upon which humanity's future would be built. In the halls of the United Earth government, decisions were being made that would affect billions of lives across dozens of star systems. President Okoro, now in her third term, met with her cabinet to discuss a new challenge, the discovery of ancient technology in the galactic core, artifacts from a civilization that had vanished millions of years ago. Multiple species wanted access to the site, each claiming some right or justification. The potential for conflict was high. "We could stake a claim ourselves," suggested the Secretary of Defense. "We have the ships in position to secure the area before anyone else can mount a serious expedition." Okoro shook her head. "And then we become the Valdren, claiming ownership of things that don't belong to us simply because we have the power to take them. No, we propose a joint expedition under neutral oversight. Every major species gets representation. Whatever we find gets shared among all participants. It will be slower and more complicated, but it's the right way to handle this." "Some species won't agree," the Secretary of State pointed out. "They'll see our restraint as weakness and try to take advantage." "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Okoro replied. "But we start from a position of principle, not power. That's what separates us from the empires that fell. We don't act based on what we can get away with. We act based on what's right. And if others choose to betray that trust, they'll learn the same lesson the Valdren learned. Humanity can be peaceful, but we're never helpless." The meeting continued late into the night, working through details and contingencies. It was exhausting, frustrating work, the kind that never made headlines but determined the course of history. Okoro sometimes envied the admirals and generals whose decisions were clear. Enemy or ally, fight or retreat, win or lose. Politics was messier, requiring constant compromise and negotiation, balancing competing interests while trying to maintain core principles. But it was also more important. Battles won wars, but policies shaped the peace that followed. When the meeting finally ended and Okoro returned to her private quarters, she stood by the window looking out at the lights of the capital city. Millions of people lived and worked there, going about their lives, mostly unaware of the challenges facing their government and species. That was how it should be. The purpose of all this effort, all these difficult decisions, was to allow ordinary people to live in peace, to raise children, pursue dreams, build lives not overshadowed by constant fear of war or conquest. She thought about her predecessors, the leaders who had guided humanity through the tumultuous first century of galactic contact. Secretary General Chen, who had faced the Valdren ultimatum with courage and defiance. President Wu, who had negotiated the peace after the Krell War. Chancellor Martinez, who had made the difficult decision to evacuate New Terra. Each had contributed to building humanity's reputation. Each had added to the legacy she now carried. And someday, someone else would stand where she stood, facing challenges she couldn't imagine, drawing on lessons not yet learned. That was the nature of history. Each generation faced its own tests, made its own choices, lived with its own consequences. But the accumulated wisdom of those who came before provided guidance, helped avoid the worst mistakes, pointed toward better paths. Humanity's story in the galaxy was relatively short, just a century old, but already it contained enough triumph and tragedy to fill libraries. Future generations would study these years, debate the decisions made, argue about what could have been done differently. That was fine. That was healthy. Societies that couldn't critically examine their own past were doomed to repeat their mistakes. Far from Earth, on the frontier worlds where humans pushed ever outward into unexplored space, settlers were carving out new lives on planets that had never known intelligent life. They terraformed hostile environments, adapted to alien ecosystems, and built communities that blended Earth traditions with the realities of their new homes. Some of these colonies would fail. Statistics suggested that perhaps 1 in 5 would be abandoned within the first generation due to unforeseen challenges. But others would thrive, would become new centers of human civilization, would develop their own cultures and contributions to the broader community. This expansion worried some in the galactic community. They saw humanity spreading like a wave across previously empty space and feared a new empire in the making. But humans pointed out that they only settled uninhabited worlds, that they actively searched for signs of intelligent life before establishing colonies, that they were willing to share space with other species rather than claiming exclusive control. The new Terra precedent had established that humanity would respect the rights of indigenous species, even at great cost to themselves. That single decision, controversial as it had been, did more to reassure the galaxy about human intentions than any diplomatic speech or treaty could accomplish. Yet expansion brought its own challenges. Human colonies sometimes came into proximity with settlements from other species, creating border disputes and cultural friction. Trade disagreements escalated into diplomatic incidents. Competition for resources in unclaimed systems led to tense standoffs. The United Earth government found itself managing a complex web of relationships, trying to balance the interests of far-flung colonies with broader strategic concerns. It was impossible to please everyone, and mistakes were inevitable. One such mistake nearly sparked a new war. A human mining operation in the Kepler sector inadvertently damaged a site sacred to the Philos, a deeply spiritual species known for their artistic achievements and long memories. The mining company had done preliminary surveys, but they had missed the significance of certain crystalline formations that held religious importance to the Philos. By the time the error was discovered, irreparable damage had been done. The Philos demanded not just reparations, but punishment of those responsible, up to and including the corporate executives who had authorized the operation. The crisis escalated quickly. Philos ships blockaded the mining operation. Human vessels moved to protect their citizens. For a tense week, 2 fleets faced each other across the void, weapons armed but no one willing to fire the first shot. Both species remembered the costs of war. Both had allies who urged restraint. But pride and anger on both sides made compromise difficult. The galaxy watched nervously, remembering how previous conflicts had started over seemingly minor incidents. President Okoro personally traveled to the Philos homeworld, an almost unprecedented gesture for a sitting Earth president. She met with the Philos Council of Elders in their great temple, a structure of living crystal that sang with harmonics audible to Philos' senses, but beyond human perception. "We wronged you," she said simply, through translators who struggled to convey human concepts in Philos terms. "Not intentionally, but that doesn't excuse the harm. We should have been more careful, more thorough in our surveys. I offer the formal apology of the United Earth government and our commitment to making this right, as much as anything can be made right." The Philos elders discussed among themselves in their musical language, a conversation that lasted hours. Finally, their spokesman addressed Okoro. "You acknowledge fault. This is rare among the great powers. The Valdren would have claimed they had the right to mine anywhere they chose. The Krell would have offered token reparations while defending their people's actions. But you come yourself, vulnerable and alone, to face our anger. This speaks to your character and your species' character. We will not have war over this tragedy, but we require that humanity takes concrete steps to ensure such desecration never happens again." The agreement that followed established protocols for archaeological and cultural surveys before any industrial operation on previously unexplored worlds. It required consultation with neighboring species about sites that might hold significance. It created a joint human-Philos commission to oversee restoration efforts at the damaged site, though both sides acknowledged some damage could never be undone. Most importantly, it demonstrated that humanity was willing to be held accountable for its mistakes, willing to make sacrifices to preserve peace, even when they had the military advantage. This pattern repeated itself over the years. Humans made mistakes, as all species did, but they generally tried to make amends rather than simply imposing their will. They negotiated when they could have demanded. They compromised when they had the power to dictate terms. It wasn't always successful. Some species saw this as weakness and tried to take advantage. Some humans grew frustrated with what they saw as unnecessary restraint, arguing that humanity should be more assertive in pursuing its interests. But the overall direction remained consistent. Humanity preferred peace to war, cooperation to domination, justice to expediency. This approach had costs. Humanity could have controlled more territory if they'd been willing to seize it by force. They could have accumulated more wealth if they'd been willing to exploit weaker species. They could have achieved more political power if they'd been willing to use their military might as leverage. Some human factions argued loudly that these sacrifices were unnecessary, that humanity was handicapping itself with moral considerations that other species didn't share. Why should humans play by stricter rules than anyone else? The answer, articulated by philosophers, historians, and thoughtful leaders, was that humanity's strength came precisely from these principles. The galaxy respected them because they demonstrated restraint. Other species allied with them because they could be trusted. The moral authority that humanity had earned through consistent behavior was worth more than the temporary advantages that might come from abandoning principles when convenient. This was the lesson of the fallen empires. Short-term gains from ruthless behavior were outweighed by long-term costs in reputation, alliances, and internal cohesion. As humanity approached its second century as a spacefaring species, the question of legacy loomed large. What kind of civilization were they building? What would future generations say about the choices made now? The galaxy was changing rapidly, with new species making first contact, old alliances shifting, and technological developments opening possibilities no one had imagined a generation ago. Humanity had to evolve while remaining true to core principles, had to adapt while maintaining identity. On Earth itself, in a museum dedicated to the history of human space exploration, an elderly woman stood before an exhibit showing the wreckage of a Valdran cruiser from that first battle a century ago. Elizabeth Torres, now in her 90s, had lived to see humanity transform from desperate defenders to respected galactic citizens. She visited the museum regularly, drawn to this particular exhibit because it represented a turning point not just in history, but in her own life. She had been a junior officer during that battle, terrified and determined in equal measure, convinced they were all going to die, but resolved to make the enemy pay for every meter of space. "Did you really think we could win?" a young voice asked. Torres turned to see a school group, dozens of children of various species, their teacher pointing her out as someone who had actually fought in the legendary first battle. Torres smiled at the question. "Win? No, we just thought we could make them regret coming here. We didn't think about victory or defeat. We thought about survival, about protecting our home, about making sure that if we died fighting rather than surrendering." She paused, remembering those desperate hours, the fear and determination, the almost reckless courage that had driven them forward. But we learned something important that day. We learned that survival isn't just about being stronger or having better weapons. It's about being willing to do whatever it takes, to adapt, to think differently, to never give up, even when every rational calculation says you should. "Is that why empires fall when they anger humanity?" one of the children asked, clearly having learned the phrase that had become almost proverbial in galactic circles. Torres considered the question carefully. "Empires fall for many reasons," she said. "But yes, in our case, the empires that attacked us fell, or were greatly weakened because they made a fundamental miscalculation. They judged us by our technology and our brief time in space. They didn't understand our history, our culture, our psychology. Humans evolved on a dangerous world. We spent hundreds of thousands of years learning to survive against predators, against environmental hazards, against each other. That experience shaped us at a fundamental level. We're adaptable, aggressive when threatened, and very, very stubborn. The empires that attacked us expected a quick, easy victory. Instead, they got a long, bloody conflict that drained their resources and exposed their weaknesses. But we're not fighting the Valdrin anymore, another child pointed out, a young Valdrin with the characteristic amber eyes. My grandparents say humans are honorable allies now. That's right, Torres agreed. And that's the other half of the lesson. Being dangerous isn't enough. Being willing to fight isn't enough. You also have to know when to stop fighting, when to make peace, when to turn enemies into friends. That's harder than winning battles. It requires putting aside anger and resentment, requires seeing your former enemies as people with their own hopes and fears, rather than just as opponents. Humanity learned that lesson too, though sometimes we didn't learn it fast enough. The teacher thanked Torres for speaking to the class, and they moved on to the next exhibit. Torres watched them go, a mixed species group of children who had never known a galaxy at war, who took for granted the peace that her generation had fought so hard to achieve. That was success, she thought. Not that people remembered the wars, but that they could forget them, could live lives not defined by conflict. The children would learn about history, but they wouldn't be trapped by it. They would face their own challenges, make their own choices, build their own future. Torres left the museum and walked slowly through the streets of the capital. The city had changed so much since her youth, filled now with buildings designed by alien architects, gardens growing plants from a dozen worlds, people of multiple species going about their daily business. It was messy and chaotic and beautiful, a living testament to what cooperation between species could achieve. Not perfect, conflicts and disagreements still arose regularly, but fundamentally peaceful. That was enough. That was everything. She thought about the question the child had asked, about why empires fell when they angered humanity. The simple answer, the one that made for good stories and dramatic histories, was that humanity was uniquely fierce, uniquely capable in warfare. But that wasn't the complete truth. Other species were fierce. Other species were capable warriors. What made humanity different was the combination of qualities: aggressive when threatened, but not inherently expansionist, willing to fight but also willing to make peace, strong enough to win wars but wise enough to win the peace that followed. The empires that fell hadn't really fallen because of humanity alone. They had fallen because they represented a way of organizing galactic society that was fundamentally unstable. Ruling through fear and force required constant application of that force. Any sign of weakness invited rebellion. Any setback could cascade into complete collapse. When humanity demonstrated that these empires could be resisted, could be fought to a standstill, or even defeated, it broke the spell of invincibility that held their systems together. The subject species of those empires had always wanted freedom. Humanity simply showed them it was possible. That was humanity's real contribution to the galaxy, Torres thought. Not military victories, though those were impressive. Not technology, though they had innovated in important ways. Not even the diplomatic framework they had helped build. The real contribution was the example. That power without justice was unstable. That might didn't make right. That the strong had a responsibility to protect rather than exploit the weak. These weren't new ideas. Many species throughout galactic history had articulated similar principles. But humanity, through its actions in that crucial first century of contact, had demonstrated them in ways that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. As Torres made her way home through the busy streets, passing humans and aliens engaged in 1,000 small interactions that made up the fabric of a functioning society, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not pride exactly, though she was proud of what humanity had accomplished. Something more profound than that, a sense that the struggle had been worthwhile, that the sacrifices made by her generation and those who came before had purchased something valuable. The children in the museum, of all species, could grow up in a galaxy where conflicts were resolved through negotiation more often than through force, where different species could coexist peacefully, trading and learning from each other, where the future held possibility rather than just fear. That night, Torres attended a memorial service for those who had died in the first battle with the Valdren. The ceremony was held every year, attended by survivors and the families of the fallen. Admiral Chen gave a brief speech, his words carefully chosen to honor the dead without glorifying war itself. "We remember those who gave their lives defending Earth," he said. "We remember their courage, their sacrifice, their commitment to protecting all they held dear. But we also remember what they were fighting for. Not conquest or dominance, but simply the right to exist, the right to determine their own future. That's a cause worth fighting for. And having won that right for ourselves, we have a responsibility to respect it in others. The best way to honor the fallen is to build a galaxy where such sacrifices are no longer necessary." The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence, each person lost in their own thoughts and memories. Torres thought about the people she had served with, those who hadn't survived that first desperate battle. Young men and women who had volunteered to face impossible odds because someone had to, because the alternative was surrender, because they believed that some things were worth dying for. She had survived, had lived to see the galaxy transformed, but she had never forgotten those who hadn't been so fortunate. Their names were inscribed on memorials across Earth and the colonies, ensuring that future generations would remember the price of peace. After the ceremony, Torres walked home alone through quiet streets, tired from the day's activities. She was old now, her body failing in ways that medicine could slow, but not stop. Soon enough, she would join those she had served with, becoming another name on the memorials, another piece of history for future generations to study. The thought didn't frighten her. She had lived a full life, had seen wonders she never could have imagined as a young officer, had contributed in her own small way to shaping the galaxy's future. What more could anyone ask? In the grand scheme of things, individual lives were brief flickers against the vast expanse of cosmic time. Civilizations rose and fell over millennia. Empires that seemed eternal crumbled into dust. Stars were born and died. Everything changed. Everything eventually ended. But during their brief moments in the light, individuals could make choices that mattered. They could stand for something, fight for something, build something worth leaving behind. Humanity's first century in the galaxy had been tumultuous and bloody, but it had also been purposeful. They had established principles, built alliances, created institutions that would hopefully endure long after everyone who remembered those early days was gone. Torres reached her small apartment and stood by the window, looking up at the stars. Somewhere out there, human ships patrolled the boundaries of civilized space. Human diplomats negotiated treaties. Human settlers built new lives on distant worlds. Human children, born among the stars, grew up never having set foot on Earth. The species that had once been confined to a single planet now spread across dozens of star systems, with more being explored every year. And alongside humans traveled their allies, the species that had joined with them to build something better than the old imperial systems. The future was uncertain, as it always was. New threats would emerge, mistakes would be made, conflicts would arise that would test the fragile peace. But Torres believed, with the conviction of someone who had lived through the worst and seen humanity at its best, that they would endure. Not because they were the strongest or the smartest, not because they were destined for greatness by some cosmic plan, but because they had learned, painfully and at great cost, that survival required more than just strength. It required wisdom, flexibility, cooperation, and an unwavering commitment to certain fundamental principles. The story of humanity's rise was still being written. Each day added new chapters, new challenges, new triumphs and failures. The children growing up across human space would write their own stories, face their own tests, make their own contributions to the ongoing narrative. Some would become leaders, shaping policy and directing fleets. Others would be teachers, artists, scientists, explorers, or simply ordinary people living ordinary lives. All of them, knowingly or not, would carry forward the legacy of those who had come before. The values learned in conflict would hopefully endure in peace. The courage displayed in desperate battles would hopefully translate to the courage needed for the harder work of building just societies and maintaining peaceful relationships. Torres finally turned from the window and prepared for sleep. Tomorrow there would be another day, more work to do, more lessons to teach. As long as she lived, she would continue to contribute what she could, to pass on what she had learned, to ensure that the mistakes of the past weren't repeated. But eventually, her time would end, and others would have to carry on. She had faith they would. Humanity had proven itself capable of remarkable things when circumstances demanded it. The question now was whether they could be equally remarkable in times of peace, whether they could build a civilization worthy of the sacrifices made to establish it. These thoughts carried Torres into sleep, into dreams of starships and distant battles, of comrades lost and victories won, of a galaxy transformed from threat to home. And in the morning, life would continue, as it always did. Ships would travel between stars. Children would learn their lessons. Diplomats would negotiate treaties. Soldiers would stand watch on distant frontiers. The great project of building a better galactic society would continue, one day at a time, one decision at a time, one person at a time. The galaxy was vast beyond human comprehension. It contained countless worlds, uncounted species, phenomena and mysteries that might never be fully understood. In such immensity, humanity was just one species among thousands, occupying a tiny fraction of available space, existing for what would be barely a moment in cosmic terms. But they had made their mark. They had shown that new powers could emerge and old orders could change. They had proven that empires built on force and fear were vulnerable to those who refused to be intimidated. They had demonstrated that principle could coexist with power, that strength didn't have to corrupt, that the strong could choose to be just. Every fallen empire made one fatal mistake. They angered humanity. That phrase would echo through history, repeated by historians and politicians, by those seeking to warn others, and by those celebrating humanity's achievements. But it missed the deeper truth. The empires fell not simply because humanity fought back, but because they represented something that the galaxy was ready to move beyond. Their fall was inevitable, whether humanity was the catalyst or not. Civilizations based on domination and exploitation carried the seeds of their own destruction. Humanity didn't cause that destruction so much as accelerate it, demonstrate it, make it undeniable. In the end, humanity's greatest victory wasn't military, it was philosophical. They proved that a different approach was possible, that power could be exercised with restraint, that might didn't have to make right. They showed that a species could be both strong and just, could defend itself vigorously while respecting others, could win wars without becoming warlike. This was the example that transformed the galaxy, that gave hope to oppressed species and gave pause to would-be conquerors. It was an example that had to be maintained through constant effort, through countless small decisions, through the accumulated actions of millions of individuals across generations. The dawn rose over Earth, as it had for billions of years before humans evolved, and as it would for billions of years after humanity's ultimate fate, whatever that might be. But on this particular dawn, in this particular moment, humanity stood as a testament to resilience and principle. They had faced the test that came to all species who reach for the stars. How to interact with others who were different. How to balance self-interest with broader responsibilities. How to be strong without being cruel. They hadn't achieved perfection. They had made mistakes and would make more. But they had established a direction, set a standard, created something worth defending and worth passing on to future generations. And perhaps that was all anyone could ask. Not perfection, but honest effort. Not immunity from error, but the wisdom to learn from mistakes. Not the guarantee of eternal peace, but the commitment to prefer peace over war, negotiation over force, cooperation over domination. These principles, hard-won and dearly bought, were humanity's true legacy to the galaxy. Not the battles they won or the empires they humbled, but the example they set of what a spacefaring civilization could be if it chose justice over expedience, if it valued principles over immediate advantage, if it remembered that power was a responsibility as much as a capability. The story continued, as all stories do until they end. Humans and aliens worked together, sometimes harmoniously and sometimes with friction, building a civilization more complex and diverse than any that had come before. The old empires adapted or faded into irrelevance. New powers emerged, some friendly and some hostile, each bringing their own perspective and challenges. The galaxy spun on in its ancient dance, indifferent to the brief lives and grand ambitions of the species that populated it. But within that indifference, there was room for meaning, for purpose, for the small victories that made life worth living. Humanity had claimed their place among the stars. They had proven they couldn't be easily conquered or intimidated. They had earned the respect of species that had explored the galaxy for millennia before humans left their home planet. But more importantly, they had proven something to themselves, that they could face the vastness of space and the challenge of alien civilizations without losing the values that made them who they were. That fear didn't have to lead to aggression. That strength didn't have to corrupt. That it was possible to be both pragmatic and principled, both powerful and just. These were lessons worth learning, worth remembering, worth passing on. And so they would be, taught in schools and academies, discussed in councils and legislatures, debated by philosophers and historians, lived by ordinary people going about their daily lives. The galaxy would remember the empires that fell because they angered humanity. But more importantly, it would remember why those empires fell, because they represented a paradigm that the universe was moving beyond, because they clung to old ways when new possibilities beckoned, because they thought might made right and learned, too late, that justice was stronger than force. And in remembering, perhaps the galaxy would choose a better path. Perhaps the species that came after, the civilizations that would rise in the centuries and millennia ahead, would learn from humanity's example. Perhaps they would build something better than what came before, something more just and more peaceful, something that honored the dignity and rights of all thinking beings. That was the hope, at least. The dream that gave meaning to the struggle, that justified the sacrifices, that made all the pain and loss worthwhile. Time would tell if that dream would be realized. But for now, on this day, as Torres finally drifted into peaceful sleep, and as dawn broke over a planet that had somehow survived first contact with a hostile galaxy and emerged stronger for it, there was reason for hope. Humanity had passed its first great test. Whatever challenges the future held, they would face them with the strength of experience, the wisdom of hard-learned lessons, and the determination that had served them so well. They would endure, not because they were destined to, but because they chose to. And in the end, perhaps that choice was what mattered most. Not fate or destiny or cosmic plan, but the simple, stubborn decision to survive, to thrive, to build something worth defending in an often hostile universe. That was humanity's gift to the galaxy, and its own best hope for the future.